Pact for the Future is calling for a few main things. The first part is to include an emergency platform, and this emergency platform would allow UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres to declare an emergency at any point. It's very similar to what we saw in the language of the pandemic agreement, the pandemic treaty, that people were resistant, but unfortunately there's less awareness about this. What the language says specifically, that if there are quote, global shocks, which shock multiple regions of the world, then they could invoke this emergency platform, which would give the UN more powers to act. Now, what exactly would come from that, we don't know, because unfortunately, we have seen 3 drafts that have been released previously, the most recent one on August 27th. But as of this recording and as we're going into the summit, there has been no final version released to the public. The versions we have seen before specifically state that there needs to be an emergency platform. And when they talk about shocks, this could include a new claimed pandemic. This could include war, economic turmoil, famine. Really, it's an endless. Obviously, climate change is on that list, but it's a pretty endless list of whatever they want to claim. They then invoke this emergency platform as part of the Pact for the Future. And then what comes next, none of us really know, but definitely what they are trying to do is to give the UN more power. There's also, of course, this whole thing is a major push towards a global government. They don't like to use those terms. They prefer multilateralism or global governance. But at the end of the day, it's the same thing. It's a more empowered UN to act, to compel nations to do whatever they want. And then the other important aspect that we can get into further is the financial aspect. They keep discussing the need for a new Bretton Woods moment. And of course, Bretton Woods is the post-World War II creation of the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. Those are known as multilateral development banks. This language of the draft definitely says we need to empower and to increase and to transform these multilateral development banks. And for those who know the history of this, or if you've read John Perkins' Confessions of an Economic Hitman, you know that those banks have been used to rob and extort third world developing countries around the world for decades now and get them in debt and take their resources. So they want to inject more financial resources into this. And part of that as well is to transform the financial system. In my view, this is just another step of the Great Reset that we saw announced in 2020. Back when he was Prince Charles in 2020, he was part of the initial announcement of the Great Reset, as well as the head of the IMF. This is, as I said, just a continuation of those same policies, and climate change, the climate narrative absolutely factors into this. I'll also mention that some of the key players behind this who are going to be present would include the World Economic Forum as well as the Club of Rome. They have been calling for the UN to declare a planetary emergency as part of the Pact for the Future at the Summit of the Future. Again, we haven't seen the final language to know if that is going to be included in there. We know there's a discussion of an emergency platform, but the Club of Rome has been calling for a declaration of a planetary emergency since at least 2019, before COVID even happened. And they've been through the various funding mechanisms. There's an organization called the Stimson Center, which is funded by the Rockefeller Foundation and the Gates Foundation, and others, the Climate Governance Commission. All these bodies have been calling on the UN to declare a planetary emergency at the Summit of the Future. That, to me, is the biggest concern. I don't know if it's going to happen just yet, but they absolutely are trying to say, look, we're already in that state of emergency. Go ahead, declare it now. And then again, who knows what powers they try to grab once that happens. You sort of hinted at some of those things: carbon wallets, limiting of movement and limiting of what you can put on your dinner plate, things like that. We know those things have been discussed and are on the table, but I think it's purposely being downplayed and ignored, except for those sort of key players who are kind of already in that world. But the public at large has no idea this is even happening. And I do want to mention this just for anybody at home who is maybe feeling disempowered and wants some solutions. I'm going to be in New York City with an activist named Dan Aston Gregory, who's coming out from the UK. He's a great guy. He runs the organization called Free Humanity. People can go to freehumanity.org/pact for the future. And there's just a simple petition that they've put together. More than a petition, it's a call to action and just calling for organizations, journalists, media outlets, etc., individuals to put their name down and say, we don't consent to this. We don't abide by whatever the UN signs. That's something people can get behind. They can put a little action. The other thing I'll just mention briefly, Clayton, is that the weekend after this, we are organizing what we call the People's Reset. We're calling it our Summit for Our Future. It's a 3-day event live in the UK, but it's also going to be streamed for free on our website at thegreaterreset.org. And for 3 days, just like they're meeting for 3 days, we're talking about solutions, but instead of from the technocratic top-down control paradigm, we're talking about bottom-up solutions, growing your own food, getting off big tech, mental, physical, spiritual health, all the different things that we think can actually empower people now so that we can put our mind and our focus on what we want our 2030 to look like, instead of just only reacting and responding to what the UN or the World Economic Forum are doing, kind of inviting people to take the power back into their hands and really see how we can proactively, drive our future. So people can check that out at thegreaterreset.org. It's happening the 27th to the 29th of this month.